Well, who do you think is going to have the ideas of how we can fulfill the vision that much better, and who understands exactly what's happening in the real world, not just on, in a spreadsheet land?
People who are kind of at the very end of the rainbow, the ones who are creating value, made such a difference. For example, in World War II, the ability to kind of think about how to really space out trucks to be able to support logistics didn't come from a general or a logistician. It was from a truck driver. There's just such an endless parade of examples of people who do the work being able to have perspective on how to make that work better. It's something you see a lot in manufacturing. Safety is such an incredibly important element to often very dangerous processes. And every factory you go in will always have kind of the same safety policy, and that is zero losses, zero incidents. And that always is something I think that causes people who work in the operation to roll their eyes, because they know that that's the goal, but it's not the reality. I really ask myself, well, how do I tell more stories in the book? How do I have better analogies and examples? Because that's what the editors loved, and that was what they felt was most clear. It isn't about explaining something overly detailed better. It's recognizing the root cause of what's making your writing work.
My very special guest is a recognized leader in operational excellence with a career spanning more than 30 years in performance optimization, executive coaching, and systematic improvement. He has trained and coached over 10,000 professionals across 6 continents and helped Fortune 500 companies and nonprofits alike drive measurable results. He's also the founder of Capacity to Care, a nonprofit encouraging super performers to donate their talent, not just their time, to improve outcomes in their communities. He is George Pesansky. Welcome to the show, George.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to chat with you. We had a chance to connect after you had written an article that I saw about the flattening of middle management, and I was just really compelled by your thinking. And then I reached out to you. We had a lovely conversation. You were kind enough to send me your book. I happen to have a copy of it right here. There you go.
Thank you.
And I'd just love to just dive in and chat with you all about it today.
Thank you so much. I've really been looking forward to this. I also follow your work and was fascinated by it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great. And I'll go back to your book of Superperformance is the title. And you base the book on your field of performance optimization, which I think is endlessly fascinating. I think we just really don't stop often enough to think so much about how much better we can make things run. But my first question for you, George, is what led you to kind of take time away from your busy consulting and teaching and all the great things that you've been doing to actually sit down and write a book? As somebody who's done it, I know it's time consuming. So what motivated you to do that?
It is. In the very beginning of the book, I actually kind of make a confession that I never thought I would write a book, and actually sometimes even poked fun at consultants, trainers who start, their conversation with a book. And I was kind of encouraged to do it because there's so many things that I have found over my 30-year career that I do that people see as kind of counterintuitive and somewhat different than what might be more traditional in the approaches. And really felt like sharing that with a much larger audience than, just the small universe that I interact with really would be valuable and important. So I wanted to try to, kind of share with people who are trying to go through their performance improvement journey.
I love it. And I'm so glad that you did. I think that once you have as much experience as you do, you get to the point where you're like, I probably should pull all this together and let it help some people and not just be stuck in my head or even just with my clients. I think you've opened up an entire world to people who, otherwise might not have benefited from some of those insights. So I think it's got to be gratifying at this point now that you can have it, you can hold it in your hands and share it with the world.
It is a surreal moment when you open that box for the first time and see your book.
Yeah, it's so true. And I love being able to share my book too with folks. And sometimes you're surprised by what they take out of it. But I think to your point, I was struck as I was reading your book as to the point you just made, which is how it's some counterintuitive wisdom and insights in there. And you're like, oh, but then the way you presented it makes total sense.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. I think being able to help people drive improvement in their own lives is sometimes about showing them a little bit of a different beat. Because when you get so used to a certain rhythm, you kind of always stay in that rhythm. And I've found some of those strategies, especially when they have a little bit of a different beat to them, can really help people find a whole new step.
I think you picked a home run of a topic and a title too, which is all about super performance. I think it's very compelling and something people want to have in their lives. They might feel a little sheepish about it or might seem a little like, can I really have it? And I think you dispel the fact that we can't.
Yeah.
And you write in sort of the early beginning about how super performance itself sits at this intersection of three things: vision, strategy, and action. And I wonder, just to give us some grounding, can you tell us a little bit about what vision, strategy, and action are, how you define them, and then kind of how they relate to one another?
Yeah. And, the thing that I have always found is if you kind of start with the top of the organization and kind of think about how does that interface as it works down to the people who create value, you have a certain perspective. If you start with the people who create value and kind of work your way up to how it interfaces to the leadership in an organization, that's a whole different perspective. So this intersection is, to me, that perspective of the people who create value. And if you think about that vision, the strategy, and action, the traditional way of looking at it is, in my opinion, missing the mark. Because if I'm a person working on a team, working in a factory, working for an organization, the vision is describing for me why we're going to do something, why it's important, and ultimately the destination that we're going to get to and the value that that'll bring. The strategy is going to be the what. It's going to be the method of the tactics of the way we're going to get that job done. And then the all important one, the one that really nobody likes getting involved in, is how we execute and making sure that we execute effectively and we take those actions. So for me, that kind of common kind of view that you see in so many PowerPoint presentations is really about the why, the what, and the how. And it really is how it affects those people who create value.
I think it's it's so easy to find examples and case studies. I remember recently I was fitted for a set of golf clubs. You think, okay, great. Well, somebody had to make those, and somebody had to take those measurements so that I could hit balls into the trees, more efficiently than before, perhaps. But when you think about it, a factory can't just turn around and say, "Oh, we're just going to have customization capabilities and ship out, clubs," in that example, to somebody like super fast. Had to have a vision. Okay, personalization, advanced personalization, helping people achieve performance in a certain way. Okay, well, what about the strategy? Well, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to reconfigure? And then action is like people actually had to learn how to take new sets of instructions, and I'm sure there was new equipment involved and everything else. So it's endless, but I think your three components, and you can see how they work together to get us to the point where we're achieving that level of super performance.
It is your golf club example is such a great one, because if I'm making golf clubs, I could say that my vision is to be able to create customized clubs for unique situations for unique players, and I'm going to charge an exorbitant amount of money for those customized clubs. That's a vision of kind of what your product is and who your market is. The people working in that factory need to understand that our goal here is all about customization and the way that we can do things that are so highly customized that it really fits that individual. Because if they think our goal is to have the lowest cost clubs in the marketplace, they're not going to deliver on that. And that's where a lot of organizations, especially in operations, end up focusing on the how. They focus on the mechanics of making the product. And if we're missing those other elements of the, of the circles, you're going to end up not having people really fulfilling that full potential.
And what a mistake to look at your line workers and be like, well, they don't really need to know all this strategy and stuff. I just need them to, do this specific task. Like, well, who do you think is going to have the ideas of how we can fulfill the vision that much better? And who understands exactly what's happening in the real world, not just on, in a spreadsheet land?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I am endlessly fascinated. I like watching these sort of YouTube history things. It's my guilty pleasure, I have to admit. And the one that I've really kind of gotten into are all of these sort of unique examples of how people who are kind of at the very end of the rainbow, the ones who are creating value, made such a difference. For example, in World War II, the ability to kind of think about how to really space out trucks to be able to support logistics didn't come from a general or a logistician. It was from a truck driver kind of coming up with those ideas. And there's just such an endless parade of examples of people who do the work being able to have perspective on how to make that work better if they understand the purpose of the work.
Right. That's what it is. And so there's that intersection, just as you're describing it: vision, strategy, and action all coming together. I think if we get into the meat of the book, and you provide so many great frameworks, and it's so well grounded in your experience and even outside research. But I thought we could look at a few of the different themes and see how we ourselves can achieve this type of super performance. So we don't have time to get into all of them, but I want to pull out a couple that I found particularly compelling. And the first is this notion of the golden hour. What is the golden hour, George, and how does it help us elevate, the work that we're doing?
It's all about trying to flip the script from the traditional way of us measuring performance is usually using a lagging indicator. It's the amount of units you produce in an hour, the amount of downtime your equipment may have, and that often is the measurement that we use. The golden hour is about being able to identify when is everything working well and for how long can I sustain that level of performance. And what that does is it really puts us in the moment, puts us in, the zone where things are working. And what we're looking at is what disrupts the zone, what takes us out of that moment. And if you can start to quiet those issues, if you can identify what they are, then you can extend that period. You're never really going to drive change in process improvement by focusing on the lagging measurement. You're going to have to find something that you're going to do differently while the work is being done. So if your metrics help kind of get you to think about that and focus on it, it makes such a huge difference, especially for the people doing the work every day, where they can kind of really tell that what I'm doing right now is way better than what I did last shift or last day or last week.
That's what I really love about this too, is that, we think about operations. A lot of times we think about the industrial revolution and factories and these things. But the fact is that knowledge work too lends itself, and we still use some of these different techniques. So whether you're saying like our job is to do user experience testing for customers or whatever the output is. In my world, for example, I don't work in a factory, but I'm kind of an idea factory in a way. I write a lot of content, I host shows, I do different things. Well, if you bring that focus on those lagging indicators, managers do this in my experience a lot because that's how they're held to standards. So all of a sudden, if their dashboard lights are red or yellow and they wish they were green, they kind of fixate on that versus going and saying, well, don't just manage to the metric. Think about the golden hour of when things are going well and you're really producing at a high level. What were those circumstances and how can you preserve that as opposed to kind of chasing the number, chasing the line, so to speak?
And that kind of really gets to the point of understanding kind of what drove that moment. And we talk a lot about understanding the root cause of your success as being really critical to understanding how to have that extended golden hour. Because if we're not really appreciating, what at the source really helped me be, in the zone writing a book or in the zone with being able to support my sales, my customers, or being able to produce widgets in a factory, if I don't really know kind of what helped me get to that place, finding it again could be really challenging. And if we know that there are elements that help me put, in that zone, then let's make sure they're all there.
So you've helped us think about sort of the basis, I would say, of super performance. And a little bit later in the book, you talk about this concept of zero loss, which you can almost think of as no downtime, no delays, no defects, or whatever it might be. And you say that this notion of having zero loss is a false belief. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about how a better way, perhaps, to think about this notion of zero loss.
Yeah, it's something you see a lot in manufacturing. Safety is such an incredibly important element to often very dangerous processes. And every factory you go in will always have kind of the same safety policy, and that is zero losses, zero incidents, issues. And that always is something I think that causes people who work in the operation to roll their eyes because they know that that's the goal, but it's not the reality, that this is a dangerous operation. There are things that can hurt me. And I obviously want to be as safe as I can. But the idea that we're going to never have an issue is maybe not entirely realistic. That is really not the perspective you want to have because the reality is that, perfection is not a measurement of time. And I think when you accept that premise and we don't think about perfection as something that has to be permanent or forever, I just need to be perfect for a short period. And it kind of comes back to that golden hour concept that if I can maintain a level of performance, even for 1 minute, then that could be, an ideal state. And now the question is how do I take that 1 minute and make it 2 minutes? So when people say we can't be perfectly safe or we can't run our equipment at its ideal conditions, it's not about whether or not you can do it. It's a question of for how long can you sustain it? And that completely flips the script on how to get that higher level of potential.
Yeah, so, like, can we produce, widgets, whatever it might be? You're like, "Okay, well, if we can produce 100, how come we can't produce" how do you prolong that period of time in the case of keeping people safe, for example, and at their maximum productivity, efficiency, whatever it might be? I see where you're coming from. It's like, maybe we can't continue it indefinitely, but using it as the ideal and working backwards from that, you're now getting us back to the contributing factors or the environmental variables, or what is it that we can control that's going to keep us elongating that state?
Exactly. I literally just came back from working in a factory where we were trying to help them really elevate their level of performance. And the level that they'd like to reach, many people would believe is impossible. But what we were able to demonstrate is we exceeded that level of performance for multiple hours during a shift. Now, that demonstrates that it's possible. And it's not a question of whether you're able to achieve that level of performance. It's a question for how long can you sustain it and what's disrupting it and how can you kind of eliminate those disruptors. But also, what were the things that you were doing at the time that you had that success? And how do you then create those systems to sustain that performance and really extend those golden hours? It's a very different way of thinking, very much kind of the glass half full versus half empty.
Well, and I know in my many years of experience, mindset is where half of the action is, because the mindset really dictates sort of what we notice. It dictates our thoughts and our emotions, which influence our behaviors. And so I really love this example of being able to say, how do we prove to ourselves that something's possible? And I think it's very true that if you think about it, even outside of manufacturing, when you're managing your team and you get to that sort of super high productive, and you're like, that was really great, or that project we worked on was very successful, being able to hold that up and saying, okay, what if that was possible all the time? Like what, and as managers, sometimes, it comes down to our own vitality. And we realize that we're pushing so hard. We're not taking vacations. We're not sleeping well. And you're like, you're destroying all of the conditions that helped you be at your best this one time when that thing happened. So let's get back to that as the ideal and stay in that zone of genius kind of longer. That's all we're asking for. Not perfection, but saying that, showing ourselves what's possible.
It really is trying to concentrate that creativity, kind of concentrate that performance and not dilute yourself into the idea that I've always got to be at that level of performance. But obviously, when you're recording a podcast, when you're speaking at your keynote, this is the moment. This is where I need everything right, and I need to be prepared, and I need to understand my material, my message. And it doesn't mean that after I leave there, I can't let my guard down and not necessarily, be at my peak, because it doesn't have the same value as it did in those moments. I do think sometimes people look at performance and say, well, I need to be there all the time. The professional boxer is not at their peak performance all the time. They're at their peak the night of the fight. And it's a year of training and preparation to get to that moment.
Yeah, it's so true. I think about the Olympics a lot. You train for 4 years for that moment, and hopefully that's your peak. And not in practice, hopefully in the game,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
But another tip that you give us in the strategy section, you talk about finding the friction. So now we're talking about almost the things that prevent super performance from happening. What is that friction? What can it look like, maybe both inside of manufacturing and, for leaders? What do we do when we find friction? Like, okay, we found it. Now what?
Yeah, I think of factories a little bit like, a very cold cup of coffee that you wanted to have be maybe a little bit hotter. That as the factory works or runs, or kind of as any really operation at all, it could be a restaurant, could be, any type of small business. Uh, the lack of communication creates issues, creates problems, creates loss and waste. And those losses, that waste, that missing the call, not getting back to the customer, having the machine go down, it makes us work harder to create the same outcome. And when you're working harder to create the same outcome, you're putting in more energy. And just like that cup of coffee, if I put a bunch of energy in it in the microwave, it's going to get hot, and finding that friction usually is about finding these losses. It's about finding those places where we're not communicating well, where we're doing that rework, where things are not standardized and everybody has a different way of approaching or doing it. Inevitably, that variation is going to create a lot of friction because we're never quite sure what we're going to get. It's going to depend on who's working right now. as to the kind of answer that we may achieve or the kind of product that we're going to get.
It's so true. And I find that even in knowledge work, when you think about if you don't have access to the resources you need, and they could be resources that just make you more comfortable, or they could be resources that you actually need to do the work. It really destroys your productivity. And before you know it, you're either pulled off task or that golden hour has passed, and then you're less efficient. So I've kind of, I'm sure during the book writing process, your journey was probably similar to mine, where at first I had never written a book before. So I didn't really know what I needed to be sort of at my peak performance. And then come to realize later, like, no, I need to have this spiral notebook here, and I need to have this cup of coffee here, and I need to have these tabs open. And eventually you start figuring out, like, I need everything at my fingertips, just like a machinist would have on the line. Like, I got to have access to my tools. Otherwise, if I have to keep walking away and walking back, like, all that productivity is gone.
Yes. Yeah. And my experience could be unique, but I'm curious to see if it was. So in the editing process, to me, it was an amazing experience that at first was incredibly disappointing and frustrating, because you put all of this work into creating something, and then somebody starts to tell you all of the things about it that maybe are not so good, that need clarification or maybe entire elimination. And initially that red is what I focused on, and almost the anger of, well, why is this red here? Why is it there? And I was very lucky. The resources that helped me and edited and supported me, not only kind of showed where it was red, but kind of showed where it wasn't. And it, to me, was taking my own medicine of kind of what was in the book. And rather than focusing on what was wrong, what I realized is there were things that were right and really were clear and were well explained, stories that were engaging. And instead of going back and looking at how do I fix this red, I really ask myself, well, how do I tell more stories in the book? How do I have better analogies and examples? Because that's what the editors loved. And that was what they felt was most clear. But these moments where I may got a little too technical or got a little too detailed, it isn't about explaining something overly detailed better. It's recognizing the root cause of what's making your writing work.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience where it's humbling when somebody reads your work for the first time, because a lot of times you have ideas that you just haven't shared before. And when they come back and they're not altogether positive, then there's natural disappointment there. But when you realize that we're here to make this as good as possible, we're shared in our view of what we're trying to accomplish, then you start opening yourself up to the process a lot better. And eventually you get to the point, and I think this is true for folks that are not writing books, but who are doing any job. This is why I'm going into this depth here. But I think you get to the point where there's trust there. And my editor would call me on it and be like, well, you mailed it in on the ending of this chapter, so you're definitely going to put in more cycles on that. And you're like, but I wanted to move on, but I know you're right. And so when you have team cohesion, you have communication, you have trust, psychological safety, whether you're in manufacturing setting or any other setting, you mentioned the restaurant earlier, it could be retail. Like, all of a sudden, knowing that when we find red, the editor's red pen, it's because we have this shared vision of what perfection can look like, and we want to elongate that time we're spending in it. And I feel like then all of a sudden we open ourselves to the process saying, you know what, you're right. I could have handed this off to you in a better state, and that would have made all of our lives a lot more efficient and would have been a better outcome for our customers. Like, you need to get to that same process with your own team that George, that you and I had with our editors, I'd say.
It is. The definition of collaboration, I'm sure there's a lot of different perspectives about it, but my favorite definition of that is really about, the willingness to listen and the willingness to speak. So when I feel completely comfortable telling my editor, you're wrong, this is the most brilliant prose that you've ever read. And at the same time, they're completely willing to tell me no. But the trick is my open-mindedness to the fact that they haven't spent their career working in manufacturing sites, and the assumptions I made about their knowledge and perspective is not one that maybe most of my readers may have. So even though to me it's great, I have to be open-minded enough to collaborate with that editor. And I think that happens on the manufacturing floor. I think that happens with the sales professional in the field, with the customer service representative, even, with a physician. The greatest physicians are not necessarily the ones with the greatest knowledge. They're the ones who are going to be able to tell the patient exactly what they think, but also be willing to listen to the perspective the patient has. to be able to really collaborate on the best course of treatment to make sure that we get the greatest outcome.
I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where somebody's arguing with me that the customer's wrong, that it actually is easy to use. And you're like, we're going to go broke listening to this person. And because, it's like, you're exactly right. That you have to listen to that wise counsel when you get it. But we'll shift our attention away from sort of the friction and some of the challenges. I've always seen root cause analysis being done. Like, I only took a couple operations courses in probably my MBA program, but I really was centered around, okay, something's gone wrong. Let's do some root cause analysis. What went wrong? Let's do our fishbone diagrams and all this kind of stuff. But your point, again, counterintuitive, is that we should look for the root cause of success. You mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation, like, how is this done and why is it important?
Yeah, there's a period of time in my career where I realized that you could take really whatever the improvement methodology that you would use, the 8D method or Kempner-Trago or Fishbone's 5 Whys, logic tree, and apply it to not a problem of a defect or a failure or an incident, but to something that has worked remarkably well, and still drill into what are those kind of human physical latent causes that set the conditions, contributed to the outcome. And the method doesn't actually matter. It's the perspective that matters. And for a period of time, I was actually thinking, well, everybody must already know this. This must be something that I'm just like figuring out, like, and others have already been doing this. And I realized that wasn't the case at all. That if you, obviously go out and look, in what's been written, what's available, there's so few messages. There are few, and there's some great books, some great, groups that do this as well. But there's such little written or done around the idea of looking at the glass half full versus looking at it, half empty. And being able to take a retiring worker that has contributed the 30, 40-year career and the contributions their experience has developed, and doing that thorough root cause analysis around things that they don't even realize because they become such ingrained patterns over that 30, 40-year career. And we discover the root cause of why, when they're involved, things turn out so differently than when less experienced people are involved. Those moments of helping organizations discover that have been some of the most rewarding of my career.
It's so true. And I've been through endless retrospectives in the agile sprint methodology, from software development or performance reviews for individual employees. And it's like, what didn't go well? What went well? What do we want to do differently next time? Well, the part of what went well, or like, what's the positive parts of your performance review? It's like, yeah, let's get to the bad stuff. You're like, well, wait a second. Why don't we dwell for a moment, if we will, about what went right, so we can make sure we can either expand that or replicate that or protect that or whatever it might be. I don't know, maybe we're fighting human nature here, George. I'm not sure, but I think you're exactly right. This is counterintuitive advice that we desperately need.
I do think there's a negativity bias that as human beings, we're kind of wired to protect ourselves, to make sure that we're thinking about what could happen, what could go wrong. But I'm never advocating not thinking about the failure, not thinking about the defect. To me, if you've made a conscious decision of how much time and energy am I going to give what's going wrong in my business, and then I'm also going to focus on sustaining and making sure I have systematic ways to leverage the things that are going right, I think you're healthy. But so many leaders, so many organizations, so many people, if I ask them the question, well, what percentage of the time are you focusing on those systems that are working? They don't have an answer. And that, to me, is the only wrong answer. If you said 5% and you've chosen that, that's great. But if you don't know, that means you probably aren't doing any of it. And that means you're always just a day late, a dollar short, kind of doing the whack-a-mole, like a kid's video game, of chasing that next problem, and then the next problem, and then the next problem. And sooner or later, you're coming back to some of the same problems again.
Well, it almost feels frivolous, like you mentioned the 5 whys, like when something goes wrong, keep asking that question 5 times until you get really down to the depth of it. But what about when something goes right? Do we ask 5 whys? Do we get 3, 2? Can we get 1 why, please? Like, even 1 would be something. And I think we just it doesn't feel like the depth of exploring and mining why it went right. But we assume that it's always going to go right. And it doesn't, because everything's changing around us. Multi-generational, customer attitudes change, the environment, the economy, everything's changing. And so all of a sudden, that's a pretty dangerous assumption to make that, oh, it went fine last time. It's going to go fine again. We've mastered that. Like, not necessarily.
And a lot of times, whether it's the failure or the success, there's no magic in five. There's magic in getting to what we might call the latent or systematic cause. So when I kind of know what are the conditions that create this environment, then I can fix it if it's a problem. I can alter those conditions and make sure they don't exist again. But if I can find, again, what are those conditions, those policies, those systems that allow these correct conditions to occur, then I can also kind of nurture and sustain that. So when we're thinking about root cause analysis, whether it's a problem or a success, the advice I have for your audience is never stop until you get to that systematic root. Because if you just know what broke and you fixed it, it's like putting jumper cables on your car and say, well, I know the battery was dead and I jump started it. Now it's good. Well, that's going to probably have another dead battery if you don't figure out why the battery's going dead, right?
It's such good advice. I got to tell you, at this point, I'm like super jealous of your customers because you get to work with your clients and help them achieve these levels of super performance. But what I don't know is necessarily how you do that. So what does a typical client engagement look like? How do you actually do work to help companies really break free and get to that next level?
Yeah, well, having, the opportunity to kind of have my own organization really gives me this wonderful latitude. I'm somebody who's very comfortable in the boardroom, kind of very comfortable in front of the executives, but it is not my vibe. My vibe is where can I get my steel toes? Where can I get my earplugs? Where can I find the people who brought their lunch to work today because the vending machines are too expensive? That is really the way I engage with my clients. And whether it was in the hospitality industry and going undercover, working at the hotel as a housekeeper, or, just recently I was in a factory working nights. What I learned when I work side by side, shoulder to shoulder with those people who are earning that living and they just want better circumstances. They want work that's rewarding. They want to achieve the company's vision, but sometimes they don't even know what that is. Helping the executives know that gap and helping them improve those processes to help improve those people's circumstances. That's my approach. That's my vibe. I'm not going to do, kind of the big, kind of view. I'm going to, go out into that factory and really understand, what's happening on the ground.
I think it's really good advice for listeners too, especially if you've been in the game for a while and you're a little bit more senior. It's like get in that elevator, go down to the ground floor, figure out what's really happening, observe it, ask questions, take an active interest in those conditions, and figure out like what can we do to make it you're where value happens. What I do is management, but what you do is where the value happens. Let's make sure you've got what you need. And I think it's always eye-opening when we do that. If we get so busy managing up and going to meetings and all these things, it's like, okay, those things are necessary to a certain extent, but it's like they're no substitute for watching where the value happens, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. If I had a nickel for whether it was an executive or an engineer or another consultant or somebody looking at data, looking at a spreadsheet, looking at Pareto charts of what is our leading causes and issues, and forming very strong opinions about the strategy and the actions that we're going to take to correct or fix the circumstance, and how wrong that can be if you don't go out to where the work is being done and validate, that experience with the people who are doing that work every day. It's just such a easy and intuitive thing, but it's just so uncommon, and I think that's, such an important message that I was trying to kind of bring into the book is you've really got to be practical. It doesn't have to be complex. It has to be practical.
I love that. And it really came through in the book too, but I'll shift us over to something that's completely impractical, which is a trivia game. It's something I love to do with my guests. And I saw, for example, in your background that when you were in the U.S. Army, you were a chemicals officer. So I thought we'd get a chemistry question. So AI is going to ask us the question, are we smarter than AI? We're going to find out, George, but here it is. What is the chemical symbol for the element gold? Is it A, GD, B, AU, or C, AG? So GD, AU, or AG. So
Hey, you.
AU it is. George said it with authority. So, audience, if you're playing along at home, you can answer, is it A, GD, B, AU, or C, AG? We're going with B, and the answer is correct. That was the one. Crushed it.
Thank you.
Well, I've got a much better question for you, George, which is, where can my listeners go to learn more about you and about your book, Superperformance?
Oh, thank you so much. GeorgePesansky.com would be the place where today's podcast, as well as all of the other places where I may be writing or sharing or interviewing, would be shared. You could also go to Amazon and be able to buy a copy of both the Kindle, the hardcover, and we just released the audiobook, which I had the opportunity to narrate. So that's also available.
I love it. I love it. So listeners, I'm going to have those links for you in the show notes. You're only one click away from connecting with George, learning more about his amazing book, Superperformance. George, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your insights on excellence today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such fun.
And to you, my listener leaders, thanks for investing in yourself by listening to this podcast. If you like what we're doing over here, just do me a favor. Give me a 30-second favor, which is to leave a 5-star rating, if you would, on Spotify or wherever it is that you listen. Those ratings help other leaders discover the show, which I love, but also to help me land amazing guests like George, which is awesome. So that's it for today's show. So always remember, don't just manage the business when you can lead the people.